The federal government is putting taxpayer money on the line to push through the controversial Kinder Morgan oil pipeline expansion plan. CTV's Brianna Carson-Smith reports on new pressure tactics from the pipeline supporters.
Playing dead outside the Kinder Morgan facility in Burnaby. Wednesday, the federal government vowed to ensure the project doesn't die by stepping up financially.
We've been working closely with Kinder Morgan to address and remove the uncertainty that the NDP Horgan government has created.
The feds now promising to compensate the company for any financial loss as a result of BC's delays as a May 31st deadline looms.
If Kinder Morgan at some stage decides not to proceed with the Trans Mountain expansion project, the indemnity against financial loss would still be in place for another party who might wish to take over the project.
I think it's inappropriate. We'll leave it to other Canadians to voice their concern about that expenditure of taxpayer money.
Alberta is stepping up its own protests too, crafting a bill to limit oil flow to BC.
If the path forward for the pipeline through BC is not settled soon, I am ready and prepared to turn off the taps.
In a letter to his Alberta counterpart, BC's Attorney General calls the bill a step back towards trying to resolve differences.
We will immediately take Alberta to court to challenge this legislation if they decide to pass it.
The increased action caused friction at a news conference meant to show unity between BC political leaders in the face of flooding.
Is he prepared to eat a bit of humble pie and realize that this pipeline is going ahead?
I believe we're being reasonable and prudent.
Over and over again.
Further proving that although protesters are playing dead, no sign of the pipeline debate is lying down. Brianna Carson-Smith, CTV News, Vancouver.
During the recent spike in prices, many have called on the provincial government to offer some tax relief. Premier John Horgan addressing those demands today.
It's not just about taxes. Since we were sworn in, we've raised the carbon tax 1 cent, and gas prices have gone up 35 cents in that time. So it's not a tax question in this instance. I appreciate the Taxpayers Federation and their name. They like to come out and say taxes are the problem. This is clearly a problem of someone making an awful lot of money. Raw material prices are low, refined prices are high. Someone's making money, and it's not the people traveling around British Columbia.
Some key developments today in the ongoing Kinder Morgan dispute. The federal government announcing it's willing to financially back the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion to make sure it gets built one way or another. And Alberta passed legislation that could curtail shipments of oil to BC. Keith Baldry reports.
But I want to be clear on the government's position. We believe in this project.
With the clock ticking towards a deadline on whether Kinder Morgan pulls out of its pipeline project, the federal finance minister today vowed the pipeline will be built by someone and with federal aid if necessary.
If Kinder Morgan at some stage decides not to proceed with the Trans Mountain expansion project, the indemnity against financial loss would still be in place for another party who might wish to take over the project.
And Bill Morneau took dead aim at the pipeline's chief political opponents, BC Premier John Horgan and his NDP government.
We're here today because despite the government of British Columbia approving this project, the BC Premier Horgan's stated intentions are to do whatever it takes to stop the project, which is unconstitutional in its very purpose.
But Premier John Horgan isn't backing down from his court case that claims his government can regulate what flows through that pipeline.
We put in place a regulation, and we're asking the courts to determine if the jurisdiction is there for us. That's a reasonable thing to do.
Meanwhile, the Alberta Premier took to the microphones as well, saying that province's legislature will today pass a law that allows it to restrict oil shipments out of province, and she's threatening to use it against BC.
Albertans, British Columbians, and all Canadians should understand that if the path forward for the pipeline through BC is not settled soon, I am ready and prepared to turn off the taps.
But Notley's threat was dismissed out of hand by BC's Attorney General, who made a threat of his own.
So we believe it's obviously unconstitutional. If they attempted to use it, we'd be in court seeking an injunction to prevent them from using it. And any damages that flowed from that type of action, we would be seeking to recover those as well.
It's clear the political rhetoric surrounding the pipeline issue is getting more heated and will likely continue to do so as that May 31st deadline set by Kinder Morgan draws ever closer.
The federal finance minister is vowing to carve a path forward for the Kinder Morgan pipeline despite opposition from the BC government. Bill Morneau announced today that if Kinder Morgan decides not to go ahead with the project, other investors will step forward. Keith Baldry is joining us live from Victoria with more. And Keith, Morneau had some pretty strong words for our premier.
Yeah, Morneau talking pretty tough out there in Ottawa today, making it clear that he's going to do whatever it takes to make sure that pipeline gets built. Keep in mind, of course, May 31st is the arbitrary deadline set by Kinder Morgan as sort of a drop-dead date. They want to see enough political support for this pipeline, otherwise they intend to walk away. Bill Morneau, again, making it clear today, he thinks there's significant potential private sector investors willing to pick up the slack if Kinder Morgan walks away with the federal government's approval. Here's the finance minister.
It's not reasonable to expect a private sector actor to deal with disputes between governments. We've found a way, we believe, to deal with that political risk. And should Kinder Morgan not want to move forward with that approach to dealing with it, we think there's other private sector actors who would be willing to move forward.
So Bill Morneau, not the only politician holding a news conference related to Kinder Morgan today. Alberta Premier Rachel Notley also, again, reminding reporters that Bill 12, her province's legislation that will allow Alberta to curtail oil shipments out of the province, will become law today. At least it will pass the legislature and eventually be proclaimed. Rachel Notley again vowing to turn off the proverbial taps to BC if she doesn't see much progress. Here's the Alberta Premier.
Albertans, British Columbians, and all Canadians should understand that if the path forward for the pipeline through BC is not settled soon, I am ready and prepared to turn off the taps.
Keith, quite the threat there, but did Notley say how quickly she's prepared to act?
No, she won't provide a timeline. She did say that it'll have to be proclaimed into law. That's going to get royal assent and all that, and some regulations will have to be passed by cabinet. But she talked about, she mentioned 24 hours, but that's not what's going to happen. But she also mentioned a period of weeks or months, basically putting BC on notice that if this thing continues to sort of drag its heels and not show much progress, they're willing to invoke that legislation that, according to them, will give them the right to curtail oil shipments to BC. Now, it might not stand up to a constitutional challenge, but the outcome of any constitutional fight might not be determined for months, if not years. And in the meantime, Alberta maintains it will potentially stop the flow of oil into British Columbia. That would have a disastrous impact on the price at the pump, because about 60% of petroleum products in Metro Vancouver come from the Edmonton refinery through the existing Kinder Morgan pipeline. So the stakes are increasingly high here, Sonia. No end in sight, but that deadline continues to loom ever closer. May 31st, drop dead. We'll see what happens.
All right, Keith Baldry joining us from Victoria. Thanks, Keith.
All right.
The tensions between BC and Alberta continue to escalate tonight, this time over Alberta legislation that would allow that province to shut off the flow of oil west. Today, Attorney General David Eby says BC is preparing to sue Alberta in that province's own courts if the bill, which passed yesterday, becomes law.